Thank you, Mr. Manuel. And I would like to thank the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights for organizing this very timely forum with all the changes related to sustainable development and digital trade and all those changes happening at the moment, and for inviting me to join this panel along with your esteemed speakers and dear ambassadors. In my 5 minutes intervention, I would like to share several points on economic diplomacy in relation to my everyday work. So uh, I think economic diplomacy in the context of my country, I think, is very important. In what sense? It should be a priority for all countries in the world, in order to be used as a tool to build bridges, in order to create those economic linkages that can bring mutual interest between countries, and that could lead actually to prosperity and peace. As we said, usually when goods cross borders, weapons stop, and I think trade could be used as one of those tools to bring more peace. And I think also every country has its own model of economic diplomacy. And at the Directorate of Economy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Lebanon, we've tried over the last few years to develop our own kind of model, despite all the problems we're facing. And those models are actually not replicable. So it will actually depend primarily on the country's main economic strategic agenda, as I will explain in a minute, and basically how much they have political leverage on the international scene. For example, very briefly, we didn't have a very good experience in Lebanon with most of the trade agreement we had with partners. Lebanon actually suffered a lot in terms of trade balance, and that has affected actually the economy of the country and actually led partly to the current economic crisis we're facing. All what I want to highlight here is if economic diplomacy is not well developed, and if there is not a very strong collaboration between policymakers in the country itself and the embassies around the world, and there is a very clear vision, then it could fire back at your economy eventually. And that's a very important point, a lesson learned. Uh, Another point here is that economic diplomacy definitely have different facets, and one of them is commercial. There are some aspects that geopolitical. There also are policy and trade development, and in our case, we cannot focus on everything. Recently, in the last few years, in the case of Lebanon, our main focus has been on the commercial aspects in order to be able to help our productive sectors. So our role at the moment is mainly focused on developing market opportunities through trade and investment in order to support our productive sectors in Lebanon during the crisis. So the role of my role today as an economic attaché is primarily a business development role, working closely with the private sector and funding organizations, and creating business linkages on the daily basis. We have had actually in the last few years tremendous success at this level with this approach with our trade and investment linkages with the United States. Uh, an example of collaboration in the policy aspect, and here I urge again more and more collaboration between countries, and this forum is a good example for that. Is, for example, the GSP alliance that includes 27 countries that benefit from the GSP system to have their products entering the United States custom free. This alliance, through cooperation and through coordination, have generated interest to the United States administration to reactivate actually the GSP system, as we saw this past week with the renewed focus of the Congress on passing the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which would include actually a renewal of the GSP system, uh, and the benefits program, and also the miscellaneous tariff bill. Finally, I would like to highlight a very important point, based also on my experience in that field, is trust. And I think trust with your citizens back home, and I think Mr. Sinclair has pointed to this. Communication with your with your productive sector, your companies, association, cooperatives, your ecosystem back home is very important in order to be able to succeed in your mission and economic diplomacy. And that communication must always happen in order to make sure that what you're doing actually is bringing benefits and not firing back at them. And this actually is pointed out, but recently the USTR ambassador in the United States, Ambassador Tai, put it on the 3rd November, speaking at Georgetown University Law Center. Trade policy sits at the intersection, and I quote Her Excellency, trade policy sits at the intersection of domestic and foreign policy. So the policies we develop must be calibrated with our broader agenda. But we have seen over time that trade policy becomes unsustainably fragile when it becomes detached from the issues facing ordinary working people. And I think that point we were trying to highlight here. So later in her remarks, actually, she also highlighted the importance of building trust, and mainly trust with the government and its citizens in order to succeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Mansur.